to my channel, and welcome back to another true crime video with me, Paige Speaks. So how are you guys doing today? Did you survive Valentine's Day? Did you survive it? I hope I'm kuingia Snapchat. Huh? Aye. Kulikuwa kukali. By the way, you guys calm down. Guy. Hey. Kulikuwa hectic. Hey. You know, and it was so funny. I'm just so sorry. I'll just like take 1 minute to just talk about this Valentine's palaver. Hey, you guys, you enter social media. So this comparison is the thief of joy. You enter social media, you have one person being like, oh my god, like, I'm just so happy. I just got this one rose. My baby, I'm so happy. The next one, you're seeing, walikuwa bebebana Villa Rosa. Hey! Huh? Anyways, I made it through the week. How are you doing? I hope you're good. Anyway, guys, I don't want to spend too much time talking today. I hope your heart is okay. Usijali video today. We're actually going to be covering the video. I had posted a video a while back. I think it's been 6 months, and when I posted it, I had put it through like it was a really large file, so I put it through a compressing app. I don't want to get into the technicalities, but so that it can be compressed so it can upload faster. I was hoping I would be able to like upload it faster and take less bundles to upload it, but what actually ended up happening is that the compressor cut the video in half, so not the entirety of the video uploaded. And I just realized that I saw the comment, and I was very confused when I saw comments of people saying like, what happened after that, what happened after this, why would you leave us in suspense? And I was like, suspense? So I will be reshooting that video and uploading that today. So without further ado, let's get right into this video. So the first thing I would like to say is that I do not mean any disrespect to anybody that I talk about in this video. The second thing I would like to say is I do live next to the road, so you guys will hear cars passing, etc, etc. And the third thing I would like to just let you guys know, it's not really a disclaimer, is that this case is not really a Kenyan case. This is a case from the Gambia, but I don't really have a serious trigger warning to warn you guys about. There's no really, you know, very crazy themes today. And yeah, without further ado, let's get right into today's video. Now for today's case, I will be using very different names as to what the actual person was called for identity purposes. When the story was actually told, they changed the person's name, so we don't really know the real identity of the person. We just know that this story happened because the person didn't want to give out their identity. So the person we're going to be talking about today, well, their alias name is one Mr. Phil McLean. So who is Mr. Phil McLean? Phil McLean was actually born in Rhodesia, which is now known as Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was previously called Rhodesia during the colonial times, and that's where he was born. However, after some time, I don't know if it was after independence or what, but his family did end up relocating back to where they came from, which was England, and he actually lived in a place called Weymouth, Dorset over in England, and that's where his family ended up going back to. Now, Weymouth, Dorset is actually a pretty small town over in England. It's on the English Channel coastal side. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what they said. It's an English Channel coastal side town. So I'm going to guess it's something like Mombasa, if I'm not mistaken, but it's a pretty small town. Everybody knows everybody. You know those kind of intimate, tiny towns? Yeah. Now, one thing about Phil's family, when they moved back to Weymouth, Dorset, they actually established a fishing business where basically they had boats, etc., and they would go out into the sea and, you know, get fish, and that's how they made their living. Now, Phil would grow up most of his life learning how to fish, learning the family business, etc, etc, because he was one day obviously gonna be the one who was going to take over everything when his parents became really old. Now, when Phil finally came of age, I'm not sure what age he was, it was finally time for him to be given like the family mantle, for him to carry on everything, for him to be the one who has the family together, if you get what I mean. So it was finally his turn to have the fishery business. However, the bad thing is that when Phil finally got to run the family business and he was given his opportunity to show what he's got, the sea kind of like dried up. I don't know if that is accurate to say. People who usually fish, please let me know if this is accurate. But basically what happened is that there was no more fishes in the sea. So Phil's family business really started to take a serious serious downturn during the time that he finally takes over as the person taking care of everything, the person running the local fish shop. Now, in the beginning of the whole family business basically beginning to crumble, Phil had actually gotten married. He got himself a very beautiful wife, and the two of them would live in Weymouth, Dorset. Now, the issue is, obviously, when you marry someone, you want to get a house, you want to basically establish yourselves together. Phil was doing all of this when the business was still at least surviving and managing. However, by the time that the business was completely crumbling, the relationship between him and his wife also started crumbling with the same rate. The worse the finances got, the worse the relationship Phil had with his wife got. And it reached a point where it seemed very inevitable that the two of them would get divorced. Phil and his wife would eventually get divorced, and for some time, he was really, really depressed. I would understand, because not only is he dealing with the business, but now your wife has gone, and things are really looking hard for Phil. And it's during this time that he's really going through his depressive episodes that he finally meets one specific woman by the name of Lynn. Now, I don't know Lynn's second name because, like I told you guys, we're going to be using, like, the people who told the story used fake names because they didn't want to be identified. Anywho's, Phil meets one woman like that in his small little town called Lynn. Now, Lynn was very different to both Phil and his ex-wife altogether because Lynn had big dreams. Lynn wanted to travel the world. She didn't want to stay in Dorset. And honestly, this also encouraged Phil because Phil now all of a sudden realizes that, hey, I've always had this one specific feeling that, oh my gosh, I want to leave this town. Phil would now tell how he basically had, since he left Rhodesia and everything, he's always wanted to travel. Like, he's always felt very not at home in the small little town in Dorset. It's cold, it's dreary. He said he really wanted to travel the world. He didn't want to stay there anymore. And with his family business collapsing and his wife basically divorcing him, he's looking at it like, what do I actually have to do here? I have nothing left. And when he meets Lynn, Lynn also wants to travel, and he's just like, this is becoming more of a realization for him that he wants to travel and he wants to leave this town in Dorset. And so Phil and Lynn get together, and Phil and Lynn together decide to basically, first of all, sell his family home, sell the boat that he had gotten as an inheritance from his parents. And on top of buying the boat, he decided to close down the entirety of the business because without a boat, how are you going to go and find fish? It's a bit difficult, isn't it? And the money that they got, the two of them decided that they were going to move to a country in Africa. Now, initially, Phil wanted to move back to Rhodesia. He already felt like he had already been to Rhodesia. He basically grew up there for some time in his life. So Phil decides, you know what, let's find somewhere else to go. Let's find a new adventure. Now, the two of them would finally settle on moving to the Gambia. And in November of 1990, the two of them would finally arrive in the Gambia. Now, both of them decided to first look at how the place is, etc. for living, number one. And number two, they also wanted to start their own business there because they were like, we need to find a way to be able to basically make money. So they were kind of scoping out the place for living, number one. And also number two, for how to make money, because you can't move somewhere without being sure exactly how you're gonna make some cash. The two of them start visiting the local motels / hotels and try to basically gauge the people who own these places, how things were going. Now, I will say it wasn't as hard to gauge these people about how things were going, particularly because the places that Phil and Lynn were going to were basically owned by other Europeans. So they were getting real good answers from people who have also migrated from Europe to the Gambia to start these businesses. So Phil and Lynn started with time to feel like, yeah, this is a very good business to invest in, so let's do it. The two of them would finally decide to open their own motel. So the two of them, after this decision, decide to first of all look for a location to be able to open this motel. And one of their friends who had already relocated to the Gambia referred them to one particular property like that. And they were really, really excited, only to go to the property and you guys, it's like when you're looking for a house to rent, a lot of somebody tells you of a place and they're like, hey, but this place is really nice, and then you go there and the place they're telling you is not giving. The place was looking upside down, the paint was coming off, And on top of that, there were like homeless people who were sleeping in the place. So there was also now that issue of like, are you really gonna be the guy who's gonna kick out these homeless people? Like, is that the type of person you want to be in this life? Now, after some time, Lynn and Phil did go on looking at like other places to rent, but they realized like the other places were pretty expensive to rent, and they didn't have that kind of money, because they were still just surviving off of the money that they had gotten from selling the boat and wrapping up their family business and moving to the Gambia. So they didn't have that type of cash to be able to go and find these other high-rise places to rent. So both of them would in time decide like, you know what, let's just go and rent the dilapidated place and like do DIYs and fix it up and, you know, get everything going together. Lo and behold, they should have just taken the other expensive places. Tell me why these people didn't take 70,000 pounds back then, which is in like 1990s. Back then, 70,000 pounds to renovate this entire place. Do you know how much 70,000 pounds is in today's currency? That's 90,000 USD in today's money. 90,000 USD in Kenyan shillings ni pesa ngapi? Anywho, that's the amount of money these people decide to invest in their business. And at the end of the day, they just said they should have basically gone with the high-rise places, because, you know, they would have just moved in. Number one, the stress would have been less, and number two, the cost would have been less, because even the rent haikuwa inafika hiyo 90k, haikuwa imefika 90k. Anywho's, the two of them would finally finish renovating everything by the end of 1990, and their business was finally up and running. Now the business did very, very well. They understood their market very well. Their target was European tourists, and they understood the dynamics very, very well, being Europeans, number one, and also having other people in that market to tell them, you know, you're doing this wrong, or you're doing this right, or you should do this, etc., etc. They were really, really, like, they understood, and so the business took off from ground very quickly and very well. And by April 1991, which is literally the next year, because they finally finished everything and opened by January, so January, February, March, April, 4 months, the entire town was talking about this business and how quickly it had taken off from the ground. And because of this, a lot of the locals now wanted to go and basically see, you know, how far with what's going on at this specific restaurant that we keep hearing about. So now not only are they attracting people from Europe, they also now start attracting customers from the local area in the Gambia. Now, on one afternoon in April 1991, a specific man staggers into Phil and Lynn's motel. So the guy has just staggered in. He seems to be really, really badly like beaten up. It seems like somebody is chasing him, and he basically collapses on the bloody ground. He was injured, and so Phil and Lynn, being the good-hearted people they were, they decided that they can't chase this guy away without trying to help him get better. So they decided to carry the guy home with them and see exactly what was wrong and like nurse him back to health. Lynn took some time off of work, and she actually stayed with this stranger and actually tried to nurse the stranger back to health. I don't know many people who are willing to even take breaks off of work to take care of a stranger that they don't know, but this is what Lynn did. Now, Lynn nurses the man back to health, and with time, the man is actually able to talk. He's able to tell them exactly who he is and what happened to cause him to be able to get to where he is. So when the guy finally wakes up, he tells the couple that his name is Nick. Nick tells them that he has been rendered homeless for the past few days because he has lost his job. He tells them he's in a really bad way. He has nowhere to sleep. He has nothing to eat. And I don't even know, but I didn't see why. My question would have been, why are you injured? Why are you injured? Who beat you up? I want to know who is after you. But for some reason, they didn't see the reason to ask, why are you injured? Why are you bleeding? Anywho's, to each their own. Nick tells them this, and Lynn and Phil are just so their hearts are just so taken aback to the point where they're just like, okay, you can stay with us, it's okay, and you know, don't worry about it, we'll take care of you. I forgot to mention, Nick was actually also from Europe, according to what he told Phil and Lynn. So Phil and Lynn are looking at him like, look at this guy, he's also come here in search of better living, better future, and look at him. Things are going hectic for him. I'm sad on his behalf. So they decide to give this guy a job. And on top of giving him a job, they actually tell him that he can actually live with them. I look to find people this nice. Imagine. And by the time Nick was ready to work with them, he actually got like alishikanisha vitu like really quickly. Like he understood the job really, really fast. And with no time, he had actually risen in the ranks in the motel business. Now, a few weeks later, after Nick has now become basically the best bloody employee of the month, another man would end up walking into the motel. Now this guy's name was John, and John was actually a local. He was from the Gambia, and I don't mean to like say it in a bad way, and I don't know if this is true, but this is something that they said in like the whatever. Now John was actually quite noticeable because he walked into the place and he started drinking, and according to what Phil and Lynn said, this was like quite weird or unusual because a lot of the people in that area didn't drink for like cultural purposes. So for him to just walk into this place and just start drinking, he called a lot of attention to himself. Nonetheless, like John really didn't care. Like John was drinking his drink, he didn't give a damn, and he was enjoying himself. Now one thing that Phil and Lynn actually came to notice is that John seemed to know Nick. And it wasn't that seeming to know of like, you know, when you meet someone and you know them and you're very open about the fact that you know them, you're like, hey, say my brother, like, you know, that one where it's like you're excited to see someone. No. John and Nick seem to have a very like hush-hush type of relationship. Like Nick would come and be the one to serve John his drinks, and then they would have like kind of like a side hush-hush conversation. And Lynn is the one who noticed this first, and as she began noticing it, she tried to like go over there whenever Nick and John were over there talking and having their little hushed conversations. And Lynn says when she went there, they would immediately like stop talking. Immediately they would stop talking, and it's like that kind of like, Kwani, what's the conversation about that you have to cut it out immediately when I come? Now Lynn says one day she was actually able to successfully walk up to both of them having the conversation without them seeing her, and she says on that specific day she heard them talking about like money and money deals. And she said like not only was it like small amounts of money they were talking about money in the millions of dollars in the millions. Now Lynn would go and she would tell her man Phil, but by this point Phil honestly didn't believe his baby girl because he honestly believed Nick was a great guy. Now I will say Phil really didn't have like so many friends because the running of the business took so much time, so the only other guy friend that he had in that place was Nick, and Phil didn't want to believe that his best friend Nick could be up to nefarious purposes. Anyway, after some time, Lynn decided to just move on because she realized that, hey, he's literally not gonna see things from my perspective, and she just decides to leave it alone and let it go. In fact, she is just like, maybe I'm actually the one overreacting. You know when you gaslight yourself because someone has also gaslit you, so also you just gaslight, you join yourself in them in your own gaslighting. So they both decide that nothing could be happening, everything is happening, it's in our minds, let it go. Now, after a few months of running the business, the two of them would decide like everything was going so well, so they wanted to go back home and visit because they had enough money for the plane tickets, the business was running well, there was someone to take over there was someone to watch the business while they weren't there, who was Nick. So the two of them just decide, okay, we're just gonna head on to UK to go and visit like the people who were there. Now, as they left, they would leave Nick in charge of everything in the hotel. Now, as Phil and Lynn were getting ready to go back to the UK, Mr. Nick would actually approach Phil and ask him for a favor. Now, Nick would approach Phil on one particular afternoon, just a few like days before he was due to board the flight to go back to England, and he would tell Phil something very peculiar. Nick would tell Phil that, hey, I'm really approaching you on behalf of my friend John. Now, this was odd to Phil because he was just like, I mean, yeah, they're friends, but according to how Nick has been acting, it's not like they're BFFs, because Nick would have introduced John to us if he was BFFs with John. But Phil genuinely trusted Nick, so he was like, okay, it is what it is. Anywho's, Phil is now asked by Nick to do a favor for him on behalf of John. So Nick asks Phil if he can carry a few diamonds to the UK to have them cut. Now, he opens a little bag that he was allegedly given by John and shows Phil the diamonds that he wants to have cut. Now, according to what John says, the diamonds were big, yes, but they weren't at a huge looking diamonds. But anywho's, Phil agrees to doing this and he takes the diamonds back with him to the UK. Now, as soon as Phil gets back to the UK, he actually takes the diamonds almost immediately to go and have them cut. However, he says that when he gets to like the guy in the UK to cut the diamonds, apparently first you have to check if the diamonds are real for you to be able to cut them. And he says that as soon as he went to have them checked out, the guy at the diamond shop basically looks at him and tells him these are fake ass diamonds. this is not a real diamond. And he basically tells him like there's no point to even have this cut because you're literally, it's fake. This basically throws Phil off and he's very confused. But Phil actually assumes that John is the one who was scamming Nick. So Phil is just like, basically, obviously it's John who scammed Nick. Maybe John was given these, somebody gave him bad diamonds and he ended up giving them to Nick, because Phil wouldn't be able to believe that Nick would give him fake diamonds, because he's just like, where would Nick even get these diamonds in the first place? Anywho's, he decides to continue with his holiday because it's like, bro, they're not my diamonds. He decides to go back to his holiday and enjoy his holiday with his beautiful wife Lynn. However, sadly, Phil and Lynn's holiday would be cut really super short when one of their friends actually calls them and tells them that they need to get back to the Gambia ASAP. ASAP. Because something was going on with their, basically with their motel. So the two of them try to get information, like what's going on, what's happening, and the friend is just like, you just come, you just come, you just come. Now me, I'll just warn you now. Me, if you ever call me with that rubbish, unaniambia kuja tu, kwani, me, I'll assume munadai kuni kidnap. By then, I won't come. Phil and Lynn decide that it's more financially friendly, number one, and two, that it would make more sense if Phil goes back to the Gambia by himself first, and then he can bring back Lynn a bit later, because Lynn still had a few people she hadn't seen and a few things she still had to do in the UK. Phil makes his way back to the Gambia, and when he gets to the airport, he obviously gets a ride back to his motel. He doesn't know anything that's happening, and the whole ride there, he's just really panicked. But last, he doesn't really think that anything so serious could be happening. I think in such a situation, you would probably think like the worst thing that could be happening is maybe like there was a fire or someone broke in or something like that. What he met there was something much, much worse. Phil gets to his motel that he left there, a very successful up and running business, and when he gets there, he literally sees nothing. He is standing there in bare disbelief, and he starts to now try and think what could have happened, etc. But he realizes the only person who would know what could have happened is Nick. He's now thinking, why did Nick call me? But he's like really grappling with a lot in his mind. As he's coming to terms with everything, he's basically looking at his entire life savings gone. John and a group of his friends pull up. Now, like I said, Phil and Lynn had noticed Nick being like talk with John, but Nick had never really introduced John to them. So it was just like, this was basically one of the first times that the two of them, basically Nick and John, were really interacting. John walks up to Phil, and mind you, Phil is still very much so dazed with what's going on at his motel, and he asks Phil, where are my diamonds? And Phil is like, what? And this guy asks him again, where are my diamonds? And this is where now Phil snaps out of like the haze, and he's like, oh yeah, I meant to tell this to Nick, but the diamonds you guys gave me, according to what the guy at the shop in the UK said, he said they were fake. So basically there was no point in cutting them because they were fake diamonds. Bro, when he said this, tell me why John didn't erupt. John erupted into this crazy kind of man, and he now starts screaming at Phil, telling Phil, give me my diamonds, I want my diamonds. Mind you, John has come here with like 4 other guys, so it's just Phil by himself, and he's now being yelled at by John and 4 other buff men. Now, in the midst of him screaming at Mr. Phil, basically John tells Phil, I'm the one with all of your stuff from the motel, and I actually took your shit so that you can actually be able to give me my bloody diamonds back. And he's like, you're not gonna get your stuff back and you're not gonna run this business even if you buy more things. I'm gonna make sure you don't do business in this country until you give me my diamonds. Now Phil is here trying to explain to John that, look, it's not my fault, guy. I can show you the diamonds that I have because I have them right here. He goes to take them out, and when he just goes to take them out, have you ever been slapped? Have you ever been slapped? He was now descended on by these guys, and as they're beating him, they now tell him that those diamonds that he was given was worth 250,000 pounds. In Kenyan shillings, that's 316,000 in today's money. So you can imagine how much it was, like minus inflation, back in the day. That was a stupid amount of money. This man, without a business, because his business has literally been ransacked, without any money because he used all his life savings to invest in this business, every single thing, he has no money. He's now being told to either produce the diamonds, because they're refusing that those diamonds they gave him is fake, and they're telling him he can basically shove those ones that he's trying to convince them that are theirs, he can shove it in his face. They're refusing those diamonds, and they're now telling him, if you don't give us the diamonds, you give us 316,000 Kenyan shillings, 250,000 pounds, that is. Now, Phil tells them, I don't have this money, and I don't know where you guys want me to find this money. If you want me to at least get this money, then let me run my business and I can try and get the money back. That even enraged them even more, and they continued to now pound him, and like they beat him up so bad that he just, like, after they left, he literally lay there for just like 15 minutes just trying to jiangalia, like, what? Now, after this, as a normal person, he decides to go to the police station and report exactly what had happened. He told the cops that John was responsible for stealing everything, and told them like what exactly had happened, from the diamond story to the issue with them beating him up, etc, etc, and the ransom they're basically asking for as they hold his shit hostage. Now, can you tell me why, as he's in the middle of telling the police this, he hears somebody laughing behind the corner? As soon as he lifts his eyes like this to go and check who is that laughing, tell me why he didn't see John. Tell me why he didn't see the man who just beat him up. And the man who just beat him up was busy laughing with who? The chief of that police station. The chief of that police station. So you already know that nothing is, these guys are in cahoots. And not only are they in cahoots, they're clearly best of friends, because you can't tell me that you're cuckooing ha 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 in here, that you guys are not friends. Now, as soon as Phil sees John and basically the chief of the police station giggling and googling, he didn't actually realize that this was not like a situation that he could just easily get out of. I don't think he realized the degree of trouble that he was in, because this man then decides to turn to the cops that he was talking to, and he's like, that's the guy that did all this to me. Why would you do that? Like, why would you do that? And basically, I don't think, maybe he had never encountered corruption, maybe where he was from, because I don't think any normal human being would see something like that happening. People are laughing in cahoots. Like, why would you do that? Like, why would you set yourself up for failure like that? And as soon as he points out John and this police officer just basically shake each other's hands, and John goes on his merry way, and this chief police officer now comes over to Mr. Phil. And he basically arrests Phil and throws Phil in a cell. Now, Phil is very confused, because I don't know if he was expecting justice to be served or what, but that's not what happened, honey. He immediately arrests Phil and throws Phil into the cell. And let me just tell you guys that the situation and the condition in that cell was so deplorable. Phil was thrown into a cell with 8 other people and a bucket. The 8 people would use this one bucket to shit, and the people at the police station didn't actually employ someone to take out the shit from the bucket, like the shit and the piss from the bucket. So it had reached the point where the shit and the piss were overflowing from the bucket and like onto the ground. So Phil was basically thrown in there, and had he not been careful, he would have stumbled his way right into the shit and piss filled bucket. Now, Phil says that they were also like not fed in plates, that the food that they were eating was thrown on the same ground that the shit and piss bucket was sitting on. Imagine you're eating food from a ground where like a few meters away is a bucket filled with shit and piss. Actually, not even a few, not just the bucket, but the ground surrounding the bucket. Phil says like some other people were actually thrown into the prison, and they actually did stagger into the shit and like the shit and the piss. And Phil says that he was really feeling like very like done, because mind you, Phil had come straight to the police station without calling his baby girl Lynn back in the UK. On top of that, nobody knew that he had arrived in the country. So no one knows that he's here in this bloody cell with shit and piss. And he's basically at the mercy of the people who are in cahoots with the guy who just beat him up and took away his business. Phil says that the next morning after being arrested, he was taken by the CID to a specific room. Now, he says that the room he was taken to was like much nicer than the cell that he was obviously being kept in, and he says he was actually really relieved to have been let out of the room. Now, Phil had been taken to this room to speak actually with a police officer from the CID unit. This man was very nice according to what Phil said, and he genuinely made Phil feel like there was someone here to listen. Someone was here to help you. Someone was here to help you fight for your rights. the man who was sent in by the CID genuinely listened to what Phil had to say, and he was actually like understanding according to what Phil was saying. Like Phil was talking and the man was like, I get you, I 100% get you, you know, giving the right ad-libs when something happened crazy in the stories, like, can you imagine? And he's like, what? I can't imagine. You know, someone really making you feel like they care. Now Phil says after telling this man the story, the man told Phil that this was clearly all a misunderstanding and Phil was innocent. And Phil is like, yeah, me, I'm innocent, but then Miss G, what's up with these guys? Like, these guys are just playing me for idiot. Let me go and get your release documents, and you can sign the release documents and you'll be free to go. You can go home once you sign these release documents. So the man leaves the room and goes to get a specific set of documents, and then he comes back to Phil. Now, Phil was very suspicious when the man came back in because the guy entered with like a new set of, like a new found morale, so to speak. Phil says that before the guy left, he had been very, very understanding. He gave Phil time to talk and everything. But when the guy came back, all of a sudden, he wants to be pressuring Phil to sign these documents. He was pushing Phil, telling Phil, no, you don't have to read the documents. Like, I would never lie to you. Don't you trust me, etc., etc. And he was basically forcing Phil to sign these documents without reading them. Phil says that this made him feel very uncomfortable. So he decides to like have a quick peruse through the documents. Tell me why, as Phil is reading through these documents, this document doesn't start off this. I do hereby say this is my confession. This was basically a confession template that Phil was signing, saying that yes, he had stolen the diamonds, and that yes, he actually owed Mr. John all that 250,000 something pounds. 250 something thousand pounds, and he was being told like, if you sign this document then you can leave, but if you don't sign it then no. So obviously Phil looks up at this police officer who had been his friend all this while, and he's feeling a bit betrayed. Like, I thought we was friends, man. Phil now asks this guy, like, do you realize what you're asking me to sign? And the guy is like, yeah, like, this is the only way you're gonna be let out. And Phil now says, no, this isn't right, you can't do this, I know my rights. I know my rights. I know my rights. And he says as soon as he started doing all of this, this police officer who had been his friend kikiking, goo-goo-gooing, and giggly-goggling with him this entire time turns into this whole new person that Phil says he was like completely shook with the 360 degrees turn that this man did. And the two of them now start getting in a scuffle. Phil now amps up the antics because he's feeling like this guy is moving crazy, and he tears up the confession papers and he said, I will not sign these. And immediately the CID officer now goes from just yelling back and forth with Phil to full on implementing like military level torture techniques on Phil. Phil says this man kept him in that cell for the entirety of the next day without food, without water, and being sleep deprived. Like whenever he was about to sleep, he was slapped to wake up. Like this was full on military style torture that Phil was going through, because this man kept on telling him like, you have to sign these papers, and if you don't sign these papers, you're not leaving here. And it genuinely seemed like it was literally sign these papers or die. It's no longer even you're gonna just stay in this cell, it's sign these papers or die. Now this sleep deprivation and everything went on for 6 days, and can you imagine Phil didn't accept to sign those papers? I want to have that kind of motivation. Phil would stay silent for the entirety of the week, and during that week God really had Phil's back because somebody actually found out that Phil was being kept at the police station, and they called Lynn, who was way back home in the UK, who was also probably wondering like why her man hasn't contacted her all these days. But they call her up and they tell her like, hey, your man has been arrested and like he has nobody to help him. And they basically tell her everything that was going on. Now, when Lynn heard all of this, she actually asked one of her friends to get Phil a lawyer. And thank God the lawyer actually made his way to the police station to see Mr. Phil. Now, the way he found Phil was in a bad way. Phil was really in a bad way. And the second that Phil saw this lawyer and he heard that I've been sent by your wife, he felt so much relief, because imagine now at least you know that somebody knows you're here. Somebody is fighting for you on the outside. You're not by yourself. And as he's feeling this sense of relief, feeling like maybe I might be able to get out of here because I technically didn't do anything wrong, his lawyer told him straight up that he was going to go to jail for 10 years if he didn't pay for his representation. So basically all this lawyer had come to the station to do was not even to help Phil in the first place, was to just tell him, these are my fees. These are my legal fees. If you don't pay them, you're going to go to jail for 10 years. So you make the decision. Now, Phil miraculously had been able to keep 7,000 delacies. That's like the currency that they were using at the time, in one part of his body. I don't know if he put it up his ass. I don't know what he did, but he was able to keep that sum of money like on him, and he paid for the lawyer. Like, he just put a small bit of down payment because he didn't even have like a lot of money, and he basically begged the lawyer to just accept this for now, and when he gets out and gets enough money and he's gonna pay the lawyer like the rest, just consider this a deposit, please. The lawyer and Phil were to meet about a week later or a few days later. And tell me why the next time they met, this lawyer didn't come to the office and tell Phil that he actually couldn't represent Phil anymore. Now, you're obviously wondering why, because Phil has made all the necessary payments, everything is necessary, like everything Phil needed to do had been done. Tell me why this lawyer didn't tell Phil that the reason he couldn't actually represent Phil was because he was now the representative of John, the same guy who had put Phil in that place in the first place. So now, not only does Phil not have a lawyer, Phil doesn't have a lawyer, and his lawyer has gone to John, the same lawyer who he told the entirety of the story, the same lawyer who he had told, maybe we can argue it from this perspective, maybe we can argue it from that perspective. He told all his secrets to this lawyer, only for this lawyer to ruka him and go and now decide to go and represent Mr. John. Imagine. You guys, may I be vexed. Anywho's, and he just asked the guy for his money back, only for this guy to tell him that that was consultation fee, so he can't give him his money back. Now, during the hearing, a lot of people who Phil says he had never met came out to testify against him. He says, like, many people were claiming that they actually saw the handing over of the diamonds, and he says that that wasn't true. Now, all this time, Phil had not seen Nick. Nick was actually called to the stand by the prosecution, and Nick literally goes on to tell these people that, yeah, this man had actually stolen those diamonds, that he had given them, that he had given him huge-ass diamonds, real legit diamonds, and this guy had stolen them and run away, and now he was just here trying to lie to this entire courthouse that he hadn't stolen those things and run away, and that he needs to be brought to justice. Have you ever been shocked? Now, this really hurt Phil because, like I said, Phil had really developed a very close relationship with Mr. Nick. Now, Phil, by this point, would have gotten like other representation, and as all of this is ongoing, he decides to appeal to the court for bail, and he was actually granted bail. But the court did decide to hold on to his passport because they didn't want him to like go back to the UK or anything, because the court case was actually ongoing. Now, as soon as he's released, he decides to go and find a way to call his baby girl back in the UK, who obviously at this point must have been really, really worried. Like, imagine that type of pressure and stress. So he calls Miss Lynn up, and he tells Lynn not to come back to the Gambia because Phil says he had been told by John and his goons that if they saw his wife back in the Gambia, they were actually going to kill her. As soon as he finishes talking to his wife, he goes back to his house to await the trial, because up till this point, honestly, he's just like, I'm not guilty, so why would I run if I'm not guilty? He goes back to his house, and this was the first time he had like had a proper sleep in like the last week or two. And things honestly started to get very, very crazy very, very quickly. Phil says that on one of the nights he was actually in his house, he just starts hearing like chanting in the middle of the night, like just in the middle of the night. Okay, that wasn't the chant, but you get what I mean. Like, he starts hearing chanting in the middle of the night, and he comes out to see exactly what's going on. And in the middle of the chanting, he also hears like someone calling his name, and he comes outside to see exactly what's going on here, what's happening, like what could be the issue. As soon as Phil comes out, he sees John in the middle of men who are like chanting, and the men as well as John are like dressed in African traditionals, and then on top of that they have like different markings drawn up on their bodies. Now, as soon as Phil comes out, John lets out a scream into the night, and then he calls out and screams out Phil's name, and he tells Phil that he was going to kill Phil if Phil didn't give him his money. He then, after this, started chanting and takes out a knife, spits on the knife, looks at Phil, and then does with the knife. Now, Phil was very much so confused, and it was at this point that he quickly now realizes that, oh wait, this is like a witch hunt kind of ceremony type of looking situation. As they're all standing out there and he's watching this ceremony take place, 3 men would walk up behind him, or like sneak up behind him, and basically jump him as he was busy looking at John doing all of this. Phil says he actually lost 2 teeth from the beating that he got that night, and he says he was also like kicked only a few like seconds near death. Like, he says he was really almost gone. Had he not gotten to hospital on time, he would have genuinely died. Now, Phil says after this whole encounter, he didn't want to stay in his house anymore. Number one, because he realized that John had access to him, like at any point in any time, and nobody was gonna help him. And number two, he also says that he quickly realized like the degree to which this man was honestly powerful. So Phil decides to move away from his house, and he decides to go and seek shelter with one of his friends who lived outside town so that John couldn't be able to get him. Now, while Phil was there, his baby girl Lynn would actually make her way down to see him. She was like really worried about him, and finally she could like come and see him, because remember I had told you he had actually told her not to come down there because he was afraid that she was going to like get killed or get caught, etc., and he didn't want his baby girl going through all that. So now finally he was in a safe place, and he sends for Lynn to come and see him. Lynn and his baby girl would stay together for 3 months until like around the time when his trial was due to start. When his trial was due to start, he sent his baby girl back home to the U.S. Now, Phil's wife would leave 5 days before his court trial was supposed to begin, and Phil said that he was going to take the next 5 days to just get his head in the right space and be prepared for like any other outcome. But you know, his wife visiting and all of this really put things into perspective for him. I think it just made him realize exactly what he would be losing if he decided to just go to prison. And so Phil decides that, you know, maybe this isn't the right thing to do. Maybe I actually shouldn't stand trial. Maybe I should run away. But like I told you guys, he doesn't have what? He doesn't have a passport. So Phil is trying to figure out exactly how he can run without being caught and without needing a passport. And that's how he remembers that there were actually smugglers who used to smuggle people from the Gambia into Senegal, then from Senegal to Sierra Leone. Phil said that he had heard from Sierra Leone people could get ships to England without requiring a passport. Now, the problem with this plan is that Phil was going to have to be put in some very dangerous scenarios. Number one, the places that they were going to be using is like backstreet places. And so that means that there was no like hospitals when you got injured. There wasn't like any police stations you could run to if something bad happened. And even if something bad did happen, how were you going to find a police and tell him why you're in that country without a passport? Moreover, pertaining to the passport, although the smugglers didn't require you to have a passport, yeah, you may be stopped at like a security type check, like a security place, and they may ask you to get out of the car and give a passport, because the people in Senegal and the people in Sierra Leone were very much aware of the fact that there are people trying to smuggle from the Gambia to Sierra Leone so they can take these ships to England illegally. So Phil decides, you know what, I probably am going to be thrown into jail, considering all of the political and spiritual kind of connect that this guy John has. So let me just take my chances and try this route. Now, Phil was pretty scared because number one, even though these are smugglers, John has a lot of connections. So he was really scared that John would find out that he was trying to run and John would just end up doing extrajudicial killing. However, Phil pulls himself together and he makes his way to the market where he was going to get people to smuggle him all the way to Sierra Leone so that he can board the ship to England. Now, Phil would pay them with some money that his baby girl had brought for him from where she had come from. So he had to get on the bus to Senegal immediately. Now, by the end of the first day, he was actually over the Senegalese border. And by the beginning of like the second day of the journey, they were now making their way to Sierra Leone. Now, in the beginning of the second day, they would come across a government checkpoint. Phil starts panicking because he's realizing that these government people might actually return him all the way back to the Gambia, which is where he was trying to escape from. Anywho, they pull up to the government checkpoint and Phil is asked to get out of the car alongside everybody else in the car so that they can like show their identification, etc, etc. Now these government officers actually have guns, like in case you decide to try to be smart and you're the one who wants to like give them a run for their money. So they were ready to shoot anyone who wanted to try some rubbish stupid games. Now Phil had gotten some money from his baby girl, like I had told you guys, and so Phil decides that he was going to bribe the officer. Phil says he wasn't like well versed in bribing because like where he was from, he had never like been required to bribe for any specific reason. So he really wasn't like well versed in bribing, how it's done, how is he supposed to go about it. So Phil waits for the police or the security guard who is supposed to check him, waits for him to come over to him, and he like reaches out his hand. And mind you, this guy has a gun, so he could like think you're trying to steal his gun. So he reaches out his hand and hands over the money into the police guard's like hand. When the police guard is just like, where's your passport? Phil just does, and he gives them the money. Luckily, should I say luckily? You know, I don't want to say luckily because I don't want it to seem like I'm against the law. But luckily the guy actually accepts Phil's money and he allows Phil to leave, and Phil is now on his way to Sierra Leone. As Phil is there waiting for the fisherman who is supposed to take him all the way to Sierra Leone. Now I will clarify that the fisherman wasn't actually supposed to take him to Europe. No, the fisherman apparently was actually supposed to take Phil to a boat which was then supposed to take him to Europe. Do you get me? You get me. Now as Phil is there waiting for the fisherman who is supposed to take him all the way to Sierra Leone, he is getting like a lot of stares from the people around him. And so when the fisherman comes, Phil is like really excited to go because everyone is looking at him and he doesn't want to like be found out that he's running away from the law. And when this fisherman came, the same way everybody is looking at him sideways is the same way this fisherman looks at him. And this fisherman tells Phil dead ass that it doesn't matter what you've been through, I can't take you to England. And Phil is like, why? Like, what's up? Like, what's going on? Now, the guy tells Phil that he could be an agent. He could be an undercover agent trying to figure out how these people get to Europe because it's illegal, how these people get to Europe, etc. And the guy refuses to carry Phil because he's just like, basically, you could literally sell me out. I could literally go my entire life without having businesses after you. Like, I can't carry you. You're a white man. It's suspicious. Why don't you even have your passport? Like, as a white man going to your own country, why are you smuggling into your own country? What have you done? This guy didn't want any problems with the law on that side. So the fisherman refuses to take Phil to Sierra Leone, and Phil is now stuck in this place. Now the place where they had dropped him off was 300 miles from Sierra Leone, and Phil decides that, you know what, 300 miles is not that far, and so he decides that he was going to make an attempt at walking the 300 miles to make his way to Sierra Leone so that he could be able to get the ship from Sierra Leone to England. Now I will say, now this was a pretty dangerous endeavor because number one, the route that Phil would be taking in order to avoid like the police and the police and everything was really dangerous because apparently there was rebel militia, and moreover the area was filled with swamps which had mosquitoes, one, and two, which were also filled with like crocodiles alongside the mosquitoes. So Phil was really basically risking his life to be able to make his way to Sierra Leone. Now Phil would try for like a whole day to make his way through the jungle and maneuver his way and find a way to get to where he needs to go to. However, sadly, Phil was not able to, and he decided to just make his way back to the fisherman, ask the fisherman to link him back with the people who brought him all the way there, and he made his way back to the Gambia to await his trial. Now Phil was smuggled back into the Gambia right on time for his trial. Actually, it was literally the night before his trial, and the next morning he says he walked to the courthouse and he was just like very resolved in knowing that he was gonna go to jail. He was like, I'm gonna go to prison, and it is what it is. And he says like he just walked that morning with an extra feeling of thankfulness to everything around him, the birds, etc. And he makes his way to the courthouse, and lo and behold, he was arrested. Now Phil would definitely be arrested, and he was actually sent to the Gambia's like most dangerous prison. It's called Naked Mile 2. according to what I saw, but I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it's the most dangerous. That's just what they said. And upon arrival, Phil says that he was beaten mercilessly. And the guards that were beating him up were telling him like he was the second white man that had been in that prison, and that the first white man who had been there had actually died in the prison. And they were basically insinuating like, you're never leaving here, and if you leave here, you're not leaving here alive. Now, Phil says that the time in prison was literal hell on earth. He says that they were only fed once a day in a small, tiny little bowl. And he said they were only fed white rice and fish. And it wasn't like a big piece of fish. It was like a tiny, tiny piece of fish. Phil was, now on top of the lack of being fed, basically, Phil was also subjected to like hard time manual labor. And according to what he says, and he's not even trying to like, I know you guys are gonna be like, eh, kani any baby. The manual labor involved like pounding the rice like in those big like wooden jars. I didn't even know you can pound rice. And the stick alone is 50 pounds, which is about like 22 kgs. And he did all of that under the hot Gambian sun. Now, I'm not trying to be racist, but Phil was white, and so him doing all of this manual labor underneath the hot scathing sun was causing like blistering and stuff on his skin, and he wasn't able to keep up with the other prisoners. And the fact that he wasn't able to keep up with the other prisoners led him to be beaten more and more. Now, thankfully, some of the inmates that he was with were actually really, really good, and they would actually help Phil when the prison guards weren't looking. So when the guard looks away, they would tell Phil to go and sit down, and like they would basically do his manual labor for him, because he couldn't, like he was being burnt in the sun. And on top of that, Phil was a very skinny man, like he wasn't able to keep up of this entire prison endeavor. Now, as all of this is happening, Phil's morale is really just being deteriorated time and time and time every single day he wakes up. And it was after the first 2 weeks that he was like so done, he was tired, he just wanted to give up. And that's when he got a visitor by the name of Mr. Norman. Now, Mr. Norman Manison was a British businessman that had set up a company in the Gambia. Now, Norman had actually visited Phil and Lynn's motel when it was still up and running and business was booming, and he had enjoyed it so much that he actually left his number with Lynn, Phil's wife. He gave the number to Lynn and told her that if you ever need something, please just call me and let me know. And one thing about Lynn, she kept that number. And one thing about Lynn, she called him to let him know she needs his help. Now, Lynn tells Norman the entire story of what has happened to Phil and everything, etc, etc. And as he's being told all of this, he's just like, oh my gosh, this is such an injustice. I need to go and talk to Phil. But when Norman goes to talk to Phil, he now discovers every single thing. And whenever Phil tells Norman that Nick, remember Nick, the guy that had been Phil's best friend, that they had given him a house, given him a place to work, when Phil tells Norman that Nick is the one who caused all of this and put him in this situation, and Nick is lying on his name, etc, etc, Mr. Norman is like, oh! Norman now tells Phil his own story about Mr. Nick. Turns out Nick was a professional scammer. Now, Norman tells Phil that he had actually employed Nick from the UK so he can come and work in his company in the Gambia. But with time, apparently Nick got like in with the wrong crowd and he started scamming people. In fact, Nick had scammed Norman of £30,000, which is about $38,000 back then in the day. So imagine how much money that is today. And he had completely disappeared after he stole this money. According to Norman, Nick had become like the mafia boss in the Gambia, and he had like friends in like really, really high places, and that's why they were able to get Mr. Phil arrested so quick and off of the back of literally no bloody evidence. Now, Norman would promise to try and help Phil, but he told Phil, I'll tell you straight up, like the gangsters that these people are running around with are very powerful, and well connected, so I don't know if I'll be able to get you out, but I'll try. Now, the first thing that Norman did for Phil was he actually got him released on bail only a week later. And Phil says that the inmates that he was with were honestly truly happy to see him go. They really felt like he was unfairly in prison, and on top of that, he was like really, really suffering in prison. It's like the guards made it a point to make him suffer And I don't know, I think maybe it's because they were getting that mandate from their fellow gangsters outside, but he was really suffering, and his inmates were really happy when he left the prison. Now 5 months later, in February of 1993, Phil had his hearing at the Gambian Supreme Court, and the charges that had been made against him were actually thrown out because they lacked any evidence. Phil was set free, and he was ready to start his life afresh. Now, Phil would leave the Gambia that day. That same day, that day. In fact, Phil entered the car and told the driver to drive to the airport and use the route of the motel so that he could just see it one last time. He and his wife moved to Spain, and according to what they said, they now live their life content in Spain. And according to Phil, it was just money. He can let it go. Anyway guys, that is it for me today. I hope you learned something from today's case. Anyway guys, I will see you guys next week again, Saturday 7 p.m. East African time. And if you are very interested in seeing more of me, you can catch me on my TikTok where I do true crime videos. You can also find me on my Instagram where I try to like post like nice pictures, but it's so difficult, isn't it? Like keeping up with the nice pictures, it's quite hard. It's quite hard. Maybe like a selfie a week. And you can also follow me on Twitter. I will see you guys next week. And yeah, that has been it for me today. Bye guys.